Let's talk about effective interpersonal communication and becoming a master communicator. Interpersonal communication is the basis of all relationships. It's what establishes our connection with others. All of it begins with a first impression. How long do you think we have for a first impression? Only 7 seconds. We really need to make it count. We only have one chance to make a first impression, so we want to make sure it's a good one. The first impression will set the tone for the entire interaction. What are some things that create first impressions? Well, let's think about nonverbals first. A lot of times the first impression is created before we even open our mouth. With nonverbals, things like eye contact. Are we looking directly into the other person's eyes? Or are we looking over their shoulder, looking down at the floor? Where are we focused? We want to make sure that our appearance is appropriate, that we're dressed appropriately for the situation, that everything is neat, clean, ironed, that we have really good personal hygiene. We want to make sure that we don't have any body odor, that our hair is clean, and that we're well groomed. What about our facial expression? Are we smiling, frowning, looking confused? We want to have an open and pleasant facial expression when we're meeting somebody for the first time. Also, our posture. Are we standing confidently, standing straight up, or are we slumping? What is our body language doing? What about our gestures? How are we moving our hands? And the handshake. This is really important with first impressions. When we first meet someone, we want to make sure that we're giving a firm and professional handshake. Usually 2 or 3 pumps is good. What we want to avoid in a handshake is the limp fish or the bone crusher. Now, by limp fish, what we mean is if somebody grabs your hand and maybe only grabs about 3 fingers, doesn't grab the entire hand where you're really connecting hand to hand, just kind of shaking the fingers at the end. In which case, often the person who's on the receiving end of a limp fish handshake feels like the other person doesn't want to touch them, doesn't really want to meet them, doesn't even want to be with them. So we want to be conscious, are we giving a limp fish handshake? The extreme opposite of that is the bone crusher. In this case, somebody is grasping your hand so hard and so firmly that it's crushing your bones. That can be very painful. And if people are wearing jewelry, it can actually cut into their flesh. So we want to be careful that we're not doing that either. Now, sometimes what happens is we might think stereotypically that the men tend to give the bone crushers and the women tend to give the limp fish. But that's not always the case. Sometimes women will give the bone crusher in an attempt to overcome, trying to appear professional by giving a good firm handshake, but overdoing it. And the same thing the other way around. Sometimes men will give the limp fish, especially if they're shaking hands with a woman, thinking, oh, I don't want to overpower her, so I'm not going to shake her hand that hard. We want to avoid both of those things because either one of those makes the other person very uncomfortable. And I actually recommend practicing it with people to make sure that you aren't accidentally guilty of one of those 2 things without even realizing it. Now, another thing with handshakes, if we're sick, if we have a cold or something like that, that is really not a good time to shake hands with other people. I actually remember being at an event not too long ago. The man who was sitting next to me was coughing and sneezing into his hands, and then he reached his hand out to shake my hand and to introduce himself. Well, I looked at him and I did not want to offend him, but I said, I'm sorry, but I feel like maybe you're sick. You were just coughing and I really can't afford to get sick right now. So would you mind if we waited and shook hands the next time that we meet? He seemed okay with that, but I just didn't want to take that chance. And we want to make sure that we aren't doing that to other people and exposing them. So if you're sick or coughing, be aware of that. And another thing too, eating situations. A lot of times we're at networking events that involve eating. So we may be sitting at a table where we're eating and somebody walks over and introduces themselves or reaches across the table. Again, when people are in the middle of eating, that is not the best time to shake hands. I remember somebody doing that to me as well. I was at a breakfast meeting about to take a bite out of a piece of toast, At that precise moment, a woman extended her hand to shake it, and I actually said the same thing to her. I said, "I'm sorry, would you mind waiting until we're finished eating breakfast, and then I'd love to shake hands with you, but right now I'm about to put food in my mouth." We just want to be aware of those things. Habit 3, listen to understand and connect, and we want to do that first before we give our own viewpoint. It's really important that we clarify understanding between ourselves and others. One of my favorite quotes is from Robert McCloskey. "I know you believe you understand what you think I said. What I'm not sure you realize is what you heard is not what I meant." Does that sound familiar? Do we sometimes have trouble communicating with each other? We're not alone. Did you know that companies actually waste $37 billion a year due to miscommunication and misunderstanding? And in fact, one of the classic examples, NASA ended up spending $300 million too much on the Mars probe because one team measured in inches and the other in centimeters. How do these communication breakdowns and misunderstandings occur? How does it happen? Well, one thing is we become too focused on ourselves and what we have to say, rather than making sure we understand the other person and that they also understand us. When we really listen and put them first, they see we care, and they are also more likely to listen to us as well. Have you ever been in a conversation at work and felt like the other person wasn't listening to you? Of course, we all have. Now, why do you think you felt that way? Well, we might think about things like their nonverbals. Maybe they weren't looking at us. Maybe they were multitasking or looking at their phone. The bottom line is, no matter what the nonverbals were saying, you felt they weren't listening to you because they weren't. We don't listen to people. In fact, we actually don't listen 75% of the time. What are we doing instead? Well, we're tuned out. We're thinking about things like, what do I want for dinner? Or what do I need to do tomorrow? What's the laundry list of every task that I have to perform the next day? But we've become masters at pretending. We smile, we nod our head, we act like we're listening, but instead we're thinking about other things. Or they say something and we are just waiting for them to stop talking so we can jump in and rebut what they just said or put in our 2 cents, give our opinion. And the minute we do that, we're no longer listening to anything else that they're saying. Now, why do we do this? There's a few different reasons. One reason is we might be thinking something like, "Oh, I already know that. I've heard this before. I already know that." Well, that's not always the best thing to do. We may know something, but if we don't use it, it doesn't make any difference what we know. And beyond that, sometimes we may know something, but we hear it in a different way or from a different person, and it changes everything. For example, I attend a lot of entrepreneur summits, and over the years, I know there was one topic that was repeatedly brought up by different people. And it had reached the point where when this topic was brought up, I tuned out. I thought, I know this. I've heard it a million times before. Well, this one particular event that I attended about a year ago, there was somebody else talking about the same topic, but they were talking about it in a slightly different way and using different examples. And I heard it for the first time in a way that made a huge difference. I took their advice to heart, started applying it in my own business, and it made a major shift in the way I was doing things. Now, if I hadn't listened again, if I had just thought to myself, well, I already know that, that wouldn't have happened. Another reason we don't listen is, well, I'm bored. I'm not interested in that topic. For example, there's certain topics that we may start tuning out when people start talking about it. I have a tendency to tune out if people get really detailed about sports scores. But we've all got our own individual things that trigger us to tune out. And then another thing that can happen is, I don't understand. Maybe somebody's talking in technical terms or they're talking about something really complex and we can't follow what they're saying. Unfortunately, in the workplace, that's when we really need to be listening. If somebody's explaining something complex to us or maybe a new way of doing something or a new policy, when we most need to be listening is when we're most likely to tune out. We need to make sure that we're speaking in a language that people can understand and not getting too technical or using other jargon they're not familiar with. For example, I was attending another entrepreneurs summit about a year and a half ago. There was a panel of angel investors ready to invest a lot of money in business ideas that they really liked. And they were also having a contest. The best business idea would win a prize of $10,000. This one man stood up and started talking. He was very excited about his idea. And I was excited too because he was so engaging. But about a minute and a half into his presentation, I started realizing I didn't know what he was talking about. Right at that precise moment, one of the angel investors stopped him and said, "Sir, I'm going to have to stop you right there." He turned to the audience and said, "How many of you know what he's talking about?" This was an audience of 400 people. Only 2 people raised their hands. Needless to say, that was a very costly communication mistake for him. He didn't win the prize, and he didn't win any investment money. So we need to match our audience, and it doesn't matter if it's an audience of one person, we're talking one-on-one with someone, or if we're talking to an audience of 1,000. We need to speak the same language so people can understand us. What about people who shout? Why do you think they do that? People who start talking over top of each other, start arguing, raising their voices. Well, one reason that they're likely to do that is because they don't feel they're being heard. And they feel like, I'm going to force you to listen to me. So they start talking louder, dominating the conversation, and maybe even turn it into an argument. And then what about people who ramble? I know we've all encountered somebody like that. We meet somebody and they start talking and they're babbling and rambling, not really saying anything, but we can't get a word in edgewise. Well, I worked at one place and there was a person there like that, and unfortunately most people avoided her because she would just not stop talking. Well, this one particular day, I was walking down the hallway and I saw her approaching me. And I thought, oh no, here she comes. What can I do? So I dove into my office, but she followed me in. So I was trapped. And she started talking, going on and on and on. And I'm trying to plan my escape route. And then an idea struck me. I thought, instead of planning a way out of here, why don't I try doing something else? I know. I'll actually listen to her. So I started listening to her. Really listening to her. Who she was, why she felt that way, where she was coming from. And she kept talking. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. About 15 minutes in, she realized that I was actually listening to her. And it was probably an experience that she wasn't used to because people were always trying to get away from her. So after she wound down, she actually never did that to me again. She did do it to other people, but she didn't do it to me. It can be really valuable to really listen to people, even those that we think talk too much. Another time that we frequently don't listen to people is if we're judging them. It's kind of like that old song by Aerosmith, Dream On. The lyrics are, "Learn from fools and from sages." We have a tendency to only want to learn from the sages, or we think that if we're learning from fools, it's only what not to do. That's not necessarily the case. One day, when I was in my master's program, I was sitting in the library surrounded by books. I had it in my mind that I was going to do that master's degree in 1 year, as fast as I could. Well, I see one of those people approaching me. There was a girl that was in several of my graduate classes. Everyone kind of thought of her as sort of a buffoon, not somebody that really had anything to contribute to the discussion, nothing of value to say. Nobody really paid any attention to what she had to say. So I saw her approaching. She comes up to me and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to do this master's degree in 1 year. In other words, I'm really busy. Go away. I've got all these books around me. Don't talk to me." She looked at me and said, "I think you're crazy." And I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, I think that you should take 2 years to do this master's degree, do the master's thesis, get a 4.0, straight A's, then you will have your top pick of the best communication PhD program in the country." And she turned and left. And I was stunned. I started thinking about it, and I slept on it, and I actually took that advice. I completely changed my master's degree program. I stayed the 2 years, I did the thesis, and I got the 4.0, and I did get into the top communication PhD program in the country. And it's all because I took the advice of someone I had no respect for, because I was judging her. So I suggest try listening to people and see what happens. Now that we've talked about effective interpersonal communication and the importance of listening, we're going to talk next about empathetic and active listening.